Okay, so let's start talking about these ideas of continuity and change and how historians utilize these concepts to interpret the past. We're going to be looking specifically or using these ideas specifically to look at the development of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So let's get started. Sometimes social structures, institutions, policies, practices, technologies, and attitudes endure for long periods of time. Historians study, describe, and explain these continuities as part of their interpretation of the past. Sometimes, however, conditions undergo revolutionary, rapid, or evolutionary, more gradual, modifications or changes. Historians explore the long range and immediate causes and effects of these changes. Some periods of history are marked by rapid changes, referred to as a turning point oftentimes. At other times, changes occur slowly as evolutionary processes. Yet all of these evolving conditions, all of these conditions, changing conditions, whether they're evolving or revolutionary, constitute important and noteworthy change. In contrast, continuities are the primary features of other periods of time. When a time period is not undergoing a significant amount of change, it's those primary features that we were talking about earlier. Those, let's see if I can find them, those social structures, institutions, policies, practices, technologies, and attitudes. Those are the things that sort of define a particular period of time. All right. So most of history includes simultaneous continuities in some conditions and changes in others, right? So there's both continuities, some things staying the same, while some things changing in other areas in some conditions. All right. Historians reflect on continuity and change either by comparing historical periods with one another or by comparing an historical period with the present. And historians, as well as non-historians, often consider changes either as progress or as decline. So, what makes change significant, or what makes change important? How do we know if it's worthy of study? Historians judge the relative significance or importance of change using several criteria. First, was there a dramatic difference between conditions before and after the change? If so, it's considered significant. Second, was the change relatively permanent? If so, significant. Third, were the effects of the change felt across a broad spectrum of people, locations, and institutions? Historians judge the significance of continuities, on the other hand, using the same criteria. Did these continuities exist over long periods of time, within specific aspects of culture or society, and or across a broad spectrum of groups? Significant changes and significant continuities are worthy of attention, investigation, and discussion. So that's why it's important to identify whether or not these types of changes or continuities had those attributes, if it significantly changed things, if there are dramatic differences, was the change relatively permanent, so on and so on. Those are the ones that are worthy of attention, investigation, and discussion. All right, so many factors can influence both changes and continuities, with historians debating the relative contribution of each. Sometimes influential individuals can promote change. Other times, natural or geographic factors can contribute to change. Oftentimes, change is a result of coincidence or chance. Changes in some features of society might be promoted by other changes, or another way of saying that something that's changed, a feature that's changed in a culture or society, can actually influence other changes or in other features of that society. Continuities, too, are influenced by a number of factors. Sometimes individuals, natural or geographic factors, or coincidence work to promote the status quo or to work to keep things the same. A quick example, you can consider the oceans on both sides of North America, for example, promoted the status quo for many generations of the native people that were living in the Americas. A lot wasn't changing necessarily until the Europeans arrived. I shouldn't say nothing was changing. It wasn't that nothing was changing, but significant change resulted in when people figured out how to traverse the oceans and communicate with people from other parts of the world. So that geographic feature or the natural feature was really keeping those changes distant for a while at least. So now that we have introduced the concepts of change and continuity, let's take a closer look how you're going to analyze these concepts in your document set. So we're going to demonstrate using document 1, which is actually President Kennedy's speech, the one he delivered on June 11, 1963, that we referred to in the introduction to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This speech actually marked the beginning of the legislative process that resulted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So first we want to think about the source and the context of the speech. So let's look at the source information at the bottom of the page. You'll be able to find your document set obviously in the folder that was created for you in Schoology. So as I'm looking here, it says recording of a speech given by President Kennedy on June 11th, 1963, telling about his civil rights goals. So I'm remembering here as I'm thinking about this, that first of all, this speech, June 11th, 1963, was less than a month after the Birmingham demonstration and the violent police response that we were looking at earlier. I'm also remembering that Kennedy was a Democrat in a divided Democratic Party. And lastly, that this speech, while it was a TV broadcast, it was a public document, which certainly would influence what he said. So let's take a look at our graphic organizer and enter some information that would be appropriate in the appropriate spot. So let's take a look. Actually, first I want to read you the directions here. It says complete the following graphic organizer as you consider how each of the documents related to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 demonstrates change, continuity, and compromise. So that's what you're going to be looking for in each of these documents. How do these documents related to the Civil Rights Act demonstrate change, continuity, and compromise? Then you're going to describe the source of the document in the first column over here. Tell how it gives evidence of change in the second column, evidence of continuity in the third column, and then evidence of compromise in the fourth column here. Some of these cells might be left blank if there's no evidence of change, continuity, or compromise in that particular document. And then you'll see there are some questions that we'll look at toward the end of this little presentation here that you'll need to answer after you're done going through all of those. So let's enter our source information here in this box. We wrote here that it was President Kennedy's speech. He was a Democrat in a divided Democratic Party. It was a public speech or a public document. It was actually after the Birmingham protests. Sorry about that. He doesn't really mention it in his speech, as we're not going to watch the whole speech for our purposes right now. I'm just going to show you guys a couple clips here and there. And that this was about 2.5 years after he was elected. So he didn't really, you may recall, he promised during his campaign to make changes for civil rights. But he had been dragging his feet because of all of these issues that we talked about, being in a divided party and didn't want to upset these Democrats or those Democrats, or Republicans might take over and so on. So again, it's important that it's 2.5 years later because civil rights leaders were getting upset and they were demanding changes, right? And remember, there were 5 things that the civil rights leaders, reformers, were really calling for. Reforms for voting rights, access to public facilities, right? Like pools and hotels and restaurants and things like that. Desegregating the schools, and employment, equal employment rights, and then lastly, the issue of poverty. So when we're looking for change, continuity, and compromise, we're going to be really thinking mostly about those 5 particular issues. So I want you to listen when I'm playing the video for any of those things being mentioned, all right? And I'm just going to play the beginning of the video, and then I'm going to fast forward to a section that is actually specifically calling for change in some of those issues. So I want you to be able to get to that part without having to watch too much of it, at least for right now. So we're going to watch the speech. I want you to listen for the examples of change. Continuity will be hard to listen for. It's more like you're going to be listening for which of those 5 things are not mentioned. Which are mentioned, which are not mentioned. The ones that are not mentioned are perhaps the areas of continuity that he is if he's willing to try to change these areas but not these, maybe that would be examples of continuity or even compromise, perhaps. So we're going to watch, and then we'll come back and we'll enter some information in the appropriate spots. All right? So let's move down here. Let's click. Actually, I already have this opened in another window here. So let's watch just the first minute or so, and then I'll fast forward a little bit.
Now an address by the President of the United States, speaking live from Washington.
Old technology.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This afternoon, following a series of threats and defiant statements, the presence of Alabama National Guardsmen was required on the University of Alabama to carry out the final and unequivocal order of the United States District Court of the Northern District of Alabama. That order called for the admission of two fairly qualified young Alabama residents who happened to have been born Negroes. That they were admitted peacefully on the campus is due in good measure to the conduct of the students at the University of Alabama who met their responsibilities in a constructive way. I hope that every American, regardless of where he lives, will stop and examine his conscience.
All right, I'm going to pause there for a second, and we're going to fast forward a little bit. The reason I wanted you to hear that part was because that, to me, is a significant example of both a continuity and a change. It's a continuity in the respect that he was using the National Guard to enforce desegregation of the schools, which happened roughly 9 years earlier in Little Rock, Arkansas. He repeated what President Eisenhower had done. But a part that would be a change would be that this is really moving into the Deep South. Arkansas is the South, but it wasn't the Deep South. And this hadn't really gone that far into the South, this move to enforce the desegregation laws. So that would be more of a change. So I'm going to fast forward now to where the point in the video, which is about 8 minutes and 20 seconds, where he actually is addressing the legislation or the legislative body, Congress, and giving ideas of what he thinks should be changed. So I'm just going to start playing that there, play it for a couple minutes, and then we'll get back to the document.
Provide, and they must be provided at this session. The old code of equity law under which we live commands for every wrong a remedy. But in too many communities, in too many parts of the country, wrongs are inflicted on Negro citizens, and there are no remedies at law. Unless the Congress acts, their only remedy is the street. I am therefore asking the Congress to enact legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public: hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments. This seems to me to be an elementary right. Its denial is an arbitrary indignity that no American in 1963 should have to endure, but many do. I recently met with scores of business leaders, urging them to take voluntary action to end this discrimination. And I've been encouraged by their response. And in the last 2 weeks, over 75 cities have seen progress made in desegregating these kinds of facilities. But many are unwilling to act alone. And for this reason, nationwide legislation is needed if we are to move this problem from the streets to the courts. I'm also asking Congress to authorize the federal government to participate more fully in lawsuits designed to end segregation in public education. We have succeeded in persuading many districts to desegregate voluntarily. Dozens have admitted Negroes without violence. Today, a Negro is attending a state-supported institution in every one of our 50 states. But the pace is very slow. Too many Negro children entering segregated grade schools at the time of the Supreme Court's decision 9 years ago will enter segregated high schools this fall, having suffered a loss which inadequate education denies the Negro a chance to get a decent job. The orderly implementation of the Supreme Court decision, therefore, cannot be left solely to those who may not have the economic resources to carry the legal action, or who may be subject to harassment. Other features will be also requested, including greater protection for the right to vote. But legislation, I repeat, cannot solve this problem alone. It must be solved in the homes of every American, in every community across our country.
Okay, so let's go back to our PowerPoint here, or our slideshow, and let's fill out this form. This is going to be filled out for you, by the way, on your actual form. When you open it up, these parts will already be added. So thinking about those 5 issues, right? Voting rights, access to facilities, desegregating the schools, employment, equal employment opportunities, and reduction of poverty, or addressing the poverty issue. These were the issues that the civil rights advocates were fighting for. So as we were listening, I was wondering about which of these 5 issues were being ignored, right? We heard him talk about, I think lastly was about the protection of voting rights. He definitely talked about desegregation of the schools, and he talked about access to facilities like theaters and restaurants and hotels and so on. But he didn't talk about the issues of poverty and issues of employment. And so I think that this speech represents, in a way, a compromise proposal. He didn't ask for all of the reforms that the civil rights leaders had hoped for, maybe because he knew that such a bill would face significant opposition from too many people to have a chance to pass. So maybe he thought, let's focus on the ones that would be most likely to be supported by most lawmakers. So let's go back to this document and add some information here. Let's add evidence of change first. I added here that he proposed legal changes integrating public facilities, lawsuits, and public school and segregated schools, and greater protections for voters. Also, there were changes at the University of Alabama that we heard at the very beginning. As for evidence of continuities here, I put here that he doesn't talk about poverty or the employment issues, which were reformers' priorities, which could also be put into the evidence of compromise, that he was willing to give those things up to try to get these things for the change. He also doesn't really mention too much. I put in here, doesn't mention the extreme behavior of reformers, meaning the protesting, etc. I don't know if I really would call those extreme behaviors, but or their most liberal requests, which would be the poverty and the employment, equal opportunity for employment, and the elimination of poverty, or at least the reduction of poverty. So he doesn't really mention those things, and so that might be considered a form of compromise. So you're going to be working similarly with the other documents in the document set. You're going to be working with your group of classmates to identify the source information, to read or to watch, because several of those are videos again. The documents together, make sure you're reading them together if you're working in groups. And then to identify the evidence of change, evidence of continuity, and evidence of compromise. And then after you're finished analyzing the documents in the document set, be sure to answer the questions at the end of the organizer, which are related to those that there were the 3 questions we asked at the very beginning. The inquiry questions: how did the clash between the forces for change, fighting for civil rights, and continuity, maybe fighting against or keeping things the same, result in the compromise referred to as the Civil Rights Act of 1964? What were the significant changes brought about by the Civil Rights Act? And what were the significant continuities that it did not alter? Now, you're going to have to look through these documents before you can really answer these questions. You heard what Kennedy was proposing, but we got to wait and see what actually ended up happening here. So what actually was changed, what actually did not change, that it failed to change or it didn't change, of those 5 goals. Should the Civil Rights Act of 1964 be considered a turning point, meaning like a revolutionary change, or is it part of a more evolutionary, gradual process? as the conditions of African Americans gradually improved. Defend your interpretation using evidence from the documents. So those are the questions you're going to ask or answer with the information from the documents. So whether you're working individually or in groups, you guys should be able to understand now how to work. Good luck.